webinar's now recording. Hi everybody. I'm delighted to introduce my friend and colleague Philip Hayton. He is Director of Research at Hayton Consulting in the UK, and he's also Senior Lecturer on the Doctorate Psychology course in the University of North London. He's also a practicing clinical psychologist, and I'm going to steal his favourite joke in that one of the important things about his clinical experience is that it spans the breadth of high-powered executives right back to psychotic patients. So he's one of the few psychologists and psychiatrists who has that breadth of experience. What he's working on over the last few years has been human development, and has helped to develop the practice of and the refinement of the leadership development profile, which is something that Hayton promotes and provides to coaches, consultants worldwide, and to learning organizations for their use. So what we're going to do today is talk about the approaches to the LDF and how to use that in coaching. I use it myself. I've found it extremely good for providing a really good roadmap of where people want to take their development. Okay, so Philip, I'm over to you, please. Please add anything else or correct anything that I may have missed in my introduction. But I'll leave it to you over the next 5 minutes. Sorry, one last part of the brief. Everybody, I will look for your questions as we go through. And what Philip said is that we'll do the presentation, and then at around 8:40 a.m. Pacific time, we'll sort of finish talking about the presentation and then move to question Q&A. But please do throw your questions into the question button as soon as you want, and we can interject with those as they seem relevant. Okay, over to you.
Lovely, thank you very much, Simon. And those of you who are joining at 8 a.m., thanks for coming in at such an early time of the day. Just to introduce the general framing of this presentation, the idea is really to do something quite brief and conversational and leave plenty of time for questions at the end. This is a short time to talk about an extremely complex topic. Coaching and development are both huge areas. So I'm going to touch on a few specifics and give you a fairly high-level overview, and then hopefully if there are things that you want to know more about, you can ask and we can get into that in the discussion. So as Simon said, I've been working with development in different ways for many years, and one of the things that I've always been very suspicious of in my work has been a sort of a concern about the way in which practitioners who want to help other people get very kind of wedded to their models. And one of the things that I think is very useful about this particular model is that it allows you to consider your relationship to all of your meaning making and your theories as a practitioner, as well as to help you think about that and talk about that with your clients. So the construct of meaning making, I think, is a really useful one, because it allows you to reconsider the way in which you literally construct your practice, the way you see the world, the way you think about your professional identity, and the approaches that you take to coaching. So it really allows you to take a big step back and look at what you're doing, why you're doing it, where it's coming from, and specifically to do that in a developmental way. And we'll say a bit more about what the developmental piece means as we go through. So let's dive in and see where we end up. So I'm going to cover 4 areas. First one is, what's development? What do we mean by it? And then go on to talk a bit about why coach for development. Some of you probably do this already, some of you may not, and be interested in what that means. In a way, everyone thinks about development and everyone coaches for development, but what we're talking about here is something quite specific. We're talking about meaning-making development, and I'll say some more about what that means in a moment. How do you coach for development of meaning making? What's the sort of technique or technology that you can use and the approaches? And then what do you do it for? What's the rationale? What's the purpose? And are there maybe some ethics and other questions that you might have about that? And obviously think about any other questions you have, and we can get into that later on. So what's development? And specifically, what's the development of meaning making? Well, there are different words for this that you've probably already come across. Transformational coaching is what Harthill has used as its terminology for many years. And really it builds upon a whole area of psychological theory called adult development theory. And there is a whole, growing, very rapidly growing field of adult development coaching. And there are webinar series and various consultancies and authors who work in that space. And a recent term for it is vertical coaching. So this is the idea that you can differentiate development in two axes. One is horizontal development, which is the development of skills, of competencies, of various kinds of awareness, various kinds of practice. And vertical development, which is more about the development of the way in which you actually make your meaning. And that's more of a transformational developmental process, as we'll explain in a moment. So vertical coaching or vertical development is a relatively recent term, but it describes the same general space that we're discussing in this webinar. So effectively, this presentation is just looking at the LDF and your coaching work. And the LDF is the Leadership Development Framework, which has been around for around 20 years. It was developed by Bill Torbert, David Rook, and Suzanne Cook-Greuter. And what they basically did was to take a whole set of existing theories and relate them to leadership specifically. So relating the idea of meaning-making development to organizational and leadership life. So what's the LDF? First of all, it's a model. It's a model that helps us to think about the way in which meaning making transforms over a person's lifetime. It's a very expanded model in that sense. It's a model that can literally be something you work with for the rest of your working life. It's also a map. So it's a way of orientating where you're currently making meaning from and what might be going on in your meaning-making capacities. It's also a spectrum. So the Leadership Development Framework refers to a spectrum of meaning-making capacities that begin, as you can see here in the little graphic, at impulsive, which might be associated with earlier meaning-making, and moves right through to strategist, alchemist, ironist meaning-making, which relates to much later stage sense-making. And it's also a metaphor because every model attempts to tell a story about some aspect of reality, but can't necessarily say that it's talking about the territory. It's talking about some kind of reality, but using a metaphorical language and a number of frames of reference. So the LDF is a number of different things. And fundamentally, it's an approach. It's an approach to thinking about development through a meaning-making lens. So we know it's an approach to development, and we know it's an approach to the development of meaning-making. What does that really mean? Well, there's four key areas really that it touches on. The first is human development generally. So meaning-making is a hugely important part of human development. It's one of the things that differentiates us from other species, is the fact that we think about our thinking. We make meaning about our meaning-making. So it's a way of thinking about human development in its broadest sense. It's an approach to thinking about meaning-making, as I've said. So what that effectively means is how you interpret your reality on an ongoing basis. The assumptions you draw upon, the principles that inform you, the things that you prioritize, All of those are reflections of the structures of meaning making that are active in you. And of course, all of that happens in context. So we all have experiences where we make meaning differently depending on what context we're in. Perhaps when we're at home, we might think about things and behave in very different ways to when we're at work or in other environments. It's also an approach to leadership development. So as we'll explain a bit later, leadership is a highly complex endeavor and role. And so it puts our meaning making under pressure because we're constantly having to grapple with complexity, volatility, ambiguity, and so on. And we're usually having to do so at considerable pace. The stakes are high, and therefore the cost of making errors can be considerable. And so in a leadership role, on an ongoing basis, our meaning making is under pressure, and the development of meaning making can be particularly useful. And then there are those wider emergent developments that take place as you work in any developmental process, and you start to knit together the various aspects of your life through a developmental lens. Other surprising things might begin to shift and change in your life. So the LDF is effectively a way of working into all of these spaces, not necessarily dividing them up, but treating them as relevant to the whole developmental process. And then we have to think about our approach to using the LDF, to using any developmental model. We have to think about the various meaning-making structures through which we perceive and make sense of what the model is trying to do. And so the moment you start entering into a meaning-making frame, fairly quickly you're thrown back on the question of, well, what about my own meaning-making? How am I framing and interpreting what the model is, what it's for, and how I'm going to use it? So it's a recursive process working with meaning making, and we are inevitably brought into the process in quite an intimate way as practitioners. We need to think about the way we use our theories, the way we use our self, all of us, body, mind, soul, spirit, the way we use the processes that we're engaged in, the way we use our experience, and so on. All of those are wrapped up in this domain of meaning making. So the LDF is an attempt, and it's, in my experience, it's a very good attempt to very expansively talk about these areas, while at the same time enabling us to have really granular and detailed conversations about the specifics. So it has this wonderful mix of expansiveness because it's a lifelong spectrum, and at the same time, real detail and real rigor that's possible with it. And that's one of the reasons I've stuck with this approach. So here's a picture of where development can lead. Here is a tree that's seen a fair few years of life. And it doesn't get to that point overnight. It goes through a journey. This is a beautiful ecosystem that we're looking at here. But it all begins somewhere very different. It all begins with something very small that we recognize as perhaps being part of the same species, but being in a completely different form. And so what we know about development is that development has recognizable phases or stages. And we have to be careful with the word stage because it can be very quickly misunderstood. But we are talking about recognizable and identifiable differences in some kind of trajectory. And so as we look at this amazing ecosystem, we can also look at where it came from and perhaps where it's going, and think about that in a chunked way. So the chunking is the important thing about working with meaning making, because that's what transforms. It's the same tree, but it has undergone some kind of transformation. And whilst many of the processes are very similar, perhaps, there are also added processes that make the whole very different. So transformation is this coexistence of continuation and discontinuity. And working with those two things is part of working with development and meaning making. So what we end up with is this kind of basic recognition that any form can transform. It's the same form and it's at the same time a different form. We can also recognize that forms actually tend to transform, living forms specifically. So living forms tend to go through transformations, and we know about that in biology. You know, we study life cycles of, you know, flies and butterflies and so on. So transformational processes are a part of what life tends to go through. We can also see that meaning itself is a form. In fact, meaning making is the creation of conceptual forms or experiential forms, constructs we sometimes call them. And we can also see, and the LDF helps us with this, we can also see that meaning making has a shape. You could say it has a kind of form. So the ways in which we typically make sense of the world has a kind of shape. We tend to use particular forms of meaning making. We'll talk a bit more about that. So when we talk about forms of meaning making, which is what the LDF refers to, and each of these labels you can see on the right here, so impulsive, opportunist, diplomat, expert, they're very simplistic labels, but what they refer to are these enormously diverse and complex forms of meaning making. You could describe them almost like worlds of meaning making, different worlds. Forms of meaning making are complex, they're inherently complex, and they have many layers in them. And one of the constructs that we use to talk about those layers is action logic. And the idea of an action logic is that it's a structure, a sort of intrinsic structure in your meaning making that informs action, not just physical action, but any kind of activity that you're engaging, thinking, feeling, sensing, working, moving, implicitly or explicitly is drawn through a meaning-making structure. And we refer to each of these labels, diplomat, expert, achiever, and so on, as an action logic. Within each action logic, there are also sub-phases. So there's early and main stage and late. So there's quite a lot of differentiation in these different forms of meaning-making. And underpinning them, but not reducible to them, are things called capacities. So meaning-making capacities like, for instance, the capacity to take perspective and to take a perspective on your perspective, and then to take a perspective on that. All of those are capacities around perspective taking, or the capacity for self-awareness, the capacity to step back and look at your experience in the moment and go deeper into it, to really inquire, is another kind of capacity that we work with a lot in the LDF and the LDP, which is the profiling tool. So meaning making has many layers. It's inherently complex. We have these high-level structures called action logics, and they refer to much deeper structures called capacities that we have to infer because we can't physically or psychologically kind of detect them directly. And there are many other layers which, you know, we haven't got time to go into now. And so to help us work into all of this complexity, it's useful to have a data set. And so what we've got in the LDF is a profiling instrument, which effectively looks at the various different forms of meaning making that are active in you at a given moment. And this assumes, as every psychometric instrument assumes, that what you're doing at this particular time in your life is indicative of maybe broader patterns in your life at the moment. And so this profiling tool is designed to help you see the shape of your own meaning making, as we talked about earlier. So it uses your data. It also uses the LDF, which is an expansive and an interesting theoretical model. It brings a developmental perspective, and then it takes all of that into what's called a coaching debrief. And a coaching debrief is a conversation one-to-one with a client, where effectively you have the opportunity to weave together these different layers of their life, their current challenge, their leadership role, their LDF data, the layers of meaning making that might be evident in it, and then the practices that they feel drawn to help them grow. you put all of this together and you weave it into what we call a developmental process or inquiry that allows them to pick that up and run with it in their own context and in their everyday life. So they can literally become the kind of orchestrator or architect of their own development and work with their experiences in a much more nuanced way. So why coach for development? If it isn't already obvious, what can we say about this question? Well, the first thing to say is that it's not about coaching for development at all. You don't necessarily go into a coaching engagement and think, right, my role here is to develop you. Development isn't done to people, and that's all part of a kind of ethical code of practice. The coach's agenda needs to be able to respond appropriately to what the client's bringing, rather than imposing upon the client what you think is the best thing to do. And yet, having said that, development is a reality for clients. Development is something that we all know is part of our life and our process, and it's very important to us. In fact, if you ask a lot of people, seriously, what really is important in their life, growth is one of those things. Health and growth is often the two things that people talk about as being really important to them. And within that come other things like relationships, love, and so on and so forth. But nurturing, nourishment, growth, development, these are the core of being a living being. So development is a reality, and it's a very important one for most people. The other thing to say about development is that when people are in a transition between particular kinds of meaning making or forms of meaning making, and we would say when they're in a process of transformation, it can be very challenging for people. And so interestingly enough, and certainly this is my experience, people often come for help when they're in a transition developmentally. It's not a coincidence that you end up thinking and talking about development often with clients. It actually feels like it's an intrinsic part of the work. And so the question, in a way, for us as coaches is whether and how we can work with this aspect of the human condition if it's relevant, rather than going on with a very strong agenda. And I'd really value some open discussion about this at the end of the presentation, because I think it's a critical piece of practice. So developing meaning making is quite an interesting topic when you think about human development as a whole. Meaning making is one specific part of what we are and what we do as human beings. There's a lot else that goes on. There's emotion, there's education, there's intellect, there's lots of other aspects to us, identity, sexuality, personality, and so on. Many elements that make up a human being and that are part of what grows as we grow. So if you think about this as a kind of beach ball, this image here, the big circle represents the entirety of human development. The small circle represents the specific area of meaning making, which is probably, to be honest, even smaller than that. It's probably tiny when you think about all the many things that are happening inside a human being, physically, emotionally, mentally, psychologically, and in other ways. So meaning making in one sense is a very, very specific thing. And yet at the same time, almost everything that we do to act into the world carries some kind of meaning making component, whether that's implicit or explicit. In other words, every time we take action and we are engaged, we're involved in some sense with meaning making, and meaning making is filtering what we're doing and how we're doing it. So even though meaning making is a very specific area of development, it has profound implications for almost everything we do and how we work with the rest of our growth. And that's why I think it's very important that if we are going to be open to doing developmental work of any kind, even if we're not specifically focusing on meaning making itself and what we call vertical development, I think it's really important that we have some awareness of this, because no matter what we work on, implicitly or maybe even explicitly in that process, the way we make sense of things will be part of what's going on, and may even be blocking what's trying to happen. So vertical development is this field of activity that specifically looks at how we grow our meaning-making capacity. And developmental transformation using the LDF effectively therefore touches on almost everything that we're engaged in and that we do, and especially if we're involved in activities like leadership, where we're always facing a lot of complexity, a lot of ambiguity, and therefore our meaning making is being stretched and tested continually. So how do you coach while being open to development? If that's the intent, how's a good way to go about it?
Philip?
Well, the first thing, sorry.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions which might sort of help,
Okay.
which to let you know about them, which we'll weave in.
Great.
So this one's from Jane Summers Kelly. Well, it's quite specific. Could you cite 2 or 3 powerful questions you use in relation to LDF that prompts your client to reflect and go there? So that's not necessarily something to answer straight off the bat, but since you're in the how do you coach using the LDF, there might be a point where that becomes relevant.
Thank you. And did you say there was another one, Simon?
No, I haven't got a specific yet. But James actually asked 2, but yeah, okay.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. Good. Okay, so just see where I am. So how do you coach for development? First thing you need is a shared language. And again, this is where a framework becomes useful, because although people interpret models and theories and concepts differently, having a shared frame of reference is very powerful. I also think that having an understanding of constructivist theory is really useful, and it's become increasingly popular in the last couple of years among coaches to understand what's called adult constructivist development. Constructivist is a psychological term, it's a technical term, it's jargon really. What it basically means is the way you construct theories on the hoof. So your kind of theories in action. And this goes way back to the work of Piaget back in the 50s and 60s, who developed a whole theory on how children develop their ability to use theories implicitly and explicitly as they grow up. So he was the first person who came up with a staged model of meaning-making development. He didn't call it that, but that's basically what he did. And that's been since expanded into the adult population to understand how meaning-making continues to evolve over the adult lifespan. So that's a very helpful background to have, and there's lots of good resources and reading that you can access, including some resources on the Heart Hill website if you're interested. You also, I think, benefit from having an extensive map that's non-restrictive. What does that mean? It means having a conceptual framework that you can draw upon that doesn't tie you down or pin you down too much to a specific philosophy or a specific kind of notion of what development is or should be. And again, that's why I quite like the LDF, because it really just says, look, there's a lifespan. And over your lifespan, there are these particular sorts of transformations that can take place. Of course, they'll take place in utterly different ways in different people, depending on your history, your personality, your context, and so on. But it does relate the whole lifespan to these sorts of developmental shifts. And I find that to be very resourcing for people in the big picture of their development. So in that sense, you also need to be able to tolerate a broad time horizon, to think about not just the immediate issue that's in front of you or that's in front of the client, but also be able to expand that into a bigger time horizon, to think about the significance of the issue within that longer time horizon. That doesn't necessarily mean going back and sort of digging into childhood memories and so on, but it does mean being able to open and expand the time frame that you're working within and that you consider with your clients. I think you also need a place to start. People always say start where you are, and I think it's a great principle. But how do you know where you are? If you've never heard of meaning making, and most leaders haven't, and you don't know anything about constructivist theory, and even most coaches don't, where do you begin? And having some kind of data, having some kind of profiling information is a useful place to start, gives you a way into the whole space, which, as I said earlier, is a very complex one. You also obviously need to do your own work. As I said at the beginning, when you meet a model of any kind, inevitably your own meaning-making frames come into play as you start thinking about it and working with it. So in standard coaching, and when I say standard coaching, I'm not being pejorative, I'm just talking about the generic forms that coaching takes. The client comes with a need, there's a set of issues and behaviors that we identify with their help. We adopt some kind of an approach, we work through what's there to work through, and the client will address some of the issues and some of them they won't. And in that process, development is kind of circumstantial. It may or may not happen. It's not particularly part of the conversation, other than in the sense of trying to develop particular strategies, particular coping methods, particular resources, new experiences, behavioral learning, and so on. So in that sense, the sort of transformational development I've been talking about isn't really intrinsic in the process, usually. In LDF coaching, what we're effectively saying is, yes, all of those things apply and all of that is good practice. But it's also likely that the client brings a development challenge too, or some kind of stretch, or maybe an opportunity that they're not able to tap into right now. So in the coaching process, they would get a profile, they'd get some data. Out of that data, they also have an indication of some specific practices they could try and reasons why they might be useful to try in their own, in their own everyday life. And they actually learn this, it's very simply put here, how to grow. What I mean by that is they learn how to work with their own meaning making as a thing. Rather than it being implicit, it becomes on the table, it becomes languaged, it becomes marked and known about, so they can start to develop a relationship to their own sense making. And in that sense, LDF coaching makes development a key component of the work. It's not the agenda, it's not come here and I'll develop you, but this is a space within which development is on the table as well as everything else. Okay, I'm just going to move on a little bit here. So just to give you one quick example of how the profiling data can support a person, here you have an example of one of our old reports, and in it you can see all of the different action logics down the left and various data here. These numbers refer to the way in which the client has filled out a form by writing their own words into a sentence completion form. And by doing that, we're able to identify the forms of meaning making that are present in what they've written. And that gives us an indication, and most clients recognize this indication, of what sorts of meaning making they typically employ. So for instance, in this graph you can see, which is called a profile graph, which is the shape of meaning making that's active for the person right now, you can see the individualist is really dominant. So we call that the primary action logic. And that is, for most people, a real sweet spot for growth. In other words, if you help to draw their attention to that area of their meaning making, they can really start to make real progress with their wider development, because they're working through a lens that's already active and already growing. So you're kind of pushing at an open door in that sense. The other action logics obviously are also important and are part of the way in which they seem to be making meaning at the moment. So we can train coaches to use the LDF not just as a profile graph and as a psychometric, but as part of a broader developmental approach to coaching. So this is just to very quickly give you a sense of the difference between some of the more typical personality assessments that we use and what a meaning-making assessment does. So typically personality assessments have a number of forced choice items, and you rate by ticking a box or by giving some indication of magnitude each sentence. And effectively what that does is it allows you to say what you already think about yourself. In that sense, the design of those forms and those tools is to reduce as much as possible the differences in the way people interpret the questions. So you want to standardize everything as much as possible. And as a consequence, of course, they can be computer generated and you get the readout at the end. On the meaning making assessment that we use at Harthill, the LDF is called a sentence completion form, which effectively means you provide a stem, and there are two examples here. Being with other people is one stem, and when I'm criticized is another. And the person in their own time decides what it is they want to write to complete that sentence. And it may or may not be one sentence, it might be longer than that, but it's not an essay. And they say what they think. They express what that stem means to them. So in that sense, rather than being very heavily standardized and trying to constrain the interpretation of each item, we're actually promoting individual interpretation, saying, yes, actually, this is what we're interested in. We're interested in how you structure and construct meaning and how you express that, because that's giving us a clue about the broader patterns and tendencies in your meaning-making structures. So in that sense, we're looking not for predefined meaning, which is the standard approach, but we're looking for emergent meaning. We're not trying to constrain interpretation, we're actually trying to give it space. And in that sense, the end result is an assessment that doesn't sort of echo what you already think about yourself, but it actually allows some surprising results to come out, things you didn't know that you thought, or ways of thinking you didn't know were so predominant or perhaps so in need of development. And very often we find that clients really resonate with what they are shown, but not necessarily able to say in advance what it is they would expect to find. Doing your own work, well, there's a lot to say here, and I guess we'll come back to that at the end among the other questions. So finally, before I move into Q&A, what do you do development for? What's it for? Well, the first thing to say about development and life generally, and you probably recognize this in your own experience, is that it's cyclical. There are things that come around, themes, dilemmas, dynamics, patterns that repeat themselves in life. Life isn't linear. It's more cyclical, it's more circular, and in that sense, it's more like a spiral. So for instance, issues of confidence, issues of feeling secure, for example, are experiences that you may grapple with in very different ways at different times in life. Perhaps as a teenager, it might be grappling with your place in your social group, and then in your early 20s, it's more insecurity and grappling with your place in your career or in your profession. And then later on, perhaps thinking about marriage or family, and then later on thinking about retirement or career aspirations and so on. So insecurity as a theme comes around, but every time it comes around, it's got a different nuance, a different flavor, a different context around it. So in that sense, we can think of life as something that represents challenges to us over and over again. And yet each time we see them differently and we work with them differently. We're still stretched, but we work with them and see them in new ways. And potentially we can draw upon earlier learning. And that's another reason why having a developmental perspective can be so helpful, because the risk, if we don't have one, is that we get caught by ideas of resolution. And ironically, resolution can actually create blockage if we try and resolve things that actually are supposed to keep coming back. It's a bit like the Chinese knot metaphor. You know, the harder you pull, the more impossible it is to get your finger out. Resolution can really get in our way. But what's the alternative to resolution? If there's a theme that keeps coming around in your life or has come back and you don't know quite what to do with it, maybe it's frustrating because you think, I've dealt with this, what's going on? Well, there might be a developmental perspective that could be very powerful to bring to that it in effect resolves the resolution impasse and allows you to get back into the real question, which is actually what's going on here? Is there some kind of new transitional development that's happening in my relationship to this theme? And how am I looking at that? Perhaps the frustration itself might be something that's ready to move and grow into something different. Who knows? So the willingness to rework what you've already done, or to recognize that what you think you've already done needs to be done again from a different place, is all part of the developmental perspective. And another reason why working with meaning-making development is so critical is because the classic example of a resolution impasse is a wicked problem. A wicked problem is a problem for which there is no solution. There is no resolution. There is nothing but coping with it and grappling with it. And complexity falls into that bracket. And development is a wicked problem. Inherently, it has no resolution. It's continuous and it continues to challenge. The moment we have developed a certain stability, something else comes and rocks the boat and challenges us again, pushes us into a new developmental chapter. And leadership is another example of a wicked problem. And as complexity in leadership increases, which I think everybody recognizes right now it is doing, it places meaning-making at a premium, as I said right at the beginning. Not only that, it makes meaning-making more difficult because under stress, we tend to regress in the capacity of our thinking. We've all had the experience of being in a job interview and suddenly finding it very difficult to reason in a coherent fashion. So meaning-making is not only at a premium when things are highly complex, meaning-making is also more difficult. As a consequence, developing our meaning-making capacities mindfully and managing that and prioritizing that really matters, not just for leadership, but for leadership in complex times and in complex situations. So I'm going to stop in a moment, but just my last comment here. I'd like to invite up to 3 people who are interested to have an experience of being profiled and having a coaching debrief with us. This is something that we would like to do on the condition that you're willing for the sentence completion form that you fill out and the coaching debrief that you have to be used for training purposes, obviously fully confidentially and anonymized and so on. But if you're interested in that, and we've offered this before and it's been really well received, I'd be delighted to hear from you, and we can take you through the process and show you how this works in a very personal way, but also to give you a sense of how this whole process can help you in your own coaching work. If you'd like to do that, please email me by the end of play tomorrow, and I'll ask someone to get in touch and we can arrange that for you. So thank you very much, and let's see what questions there are. Simon,
okay,
can we take,
everybody.
I've got the note of Jane's question, but can we take a couple of questions and then we'll sort of weave some together? Is that okay?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let me just read a few out. I won't take everybody off mute straight away because usually that ends in disaster. But let me just read a few of the questions, and then if those of you whose questions they are would like to unmute yourselves so you can have a longer discussion, great. So Inga Bielinska, how do you have final results with open-ended questions? Is there an interpreter? If yes, how do you work around the biases? Gregor Findlay has got 3 questions. Could you please give some insight into the ethical considerations, e.g. maybe the experience of having to deal with a challenge that resonates most? He's also referring to the percentages in the population in the 7 Transformations article. Curious about how much that may have changed since it was written. Um, and then Donna has asked, how do you deal with the natural inclination of people to want to be further along in their development? And how do you deal with it in systems or teams where comparing developmental levels easily happens? Gosh, we've never heard that problem before.
Yeah.
So Michelle has said she's interested in the offer. Jane Summers has said she's interested in the offer. Michelle Grillo, so do you find that the profiles are quite concentrated into a few categories rather than spread across the whole spectrum? So I'll leave you to sort of open that there. Guys, everybody on the call, if you want to, if you'd like me to unmute you, please just click the hand symbol, and I will unmute your microphone so you can speak directly. Please go ahead.
Great. Thank you. Yes, so some really great questions, and in a way it would be nice to have more time to get into a proper discussion, but I'll try and be brief and as coherent as possible. So starting with Jane's question, how do you go there? And I think Inga was sort of building on that question also. So one of the interesting things about working with meaning making is that it's like a register. So meaning making is partly about content. It's partly about what we talk about, and in that sense, specific questions can be really helpful. But in another sense, it's more about the way in which we frame and express and construct things. So in a way, you don't have to specifically ask people to talk about their meaning making or specific things to do with development. You can, obviously, and we do a lot. But in order to really get a sense of what might be going on for a person, you just have to listen, and listen with an ear for the kind of structures that the LDF helps you to hear and to identify. So just as an example, the last question, I think Donna was asking a question about what do you do with people who want to be further on in their development? This is a great question, and that kind of fundamental impulse is very associated with two particular action logics, the achiever and the expert action logics, which are inherently driven by a curiosity, not only an open-ended curiosity, but a very directional curiosity, and sometimes quite a tight curiosity around how can I get to the next thing. And so you don't have to be talking about that with somebody to really start to hear it in what they're talking about. You can hear the underlying logic in the way they construct things, in the questions they ask, in the comments they make, in their overall attitude. And that would be an example of one particular clue that might help you sense where the person is making meaning from. So I think the question of how do you go there is, it's sort of always open. The challenge for us is to be able to listen for it and to get good at hearing and feeling the temperature of what's happening in somebody's meaning making. Inga's question, I think, had partly to do with the scoring process, I think. Is that right, Inga?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I put in, if you open the chat window, Philip, because you can't see the questions, I put them all into the chat window for everybody to see.
Okay.
So you can just read them there. But Inga's was I think how do you find the results with open-ended questions? Is there an interpreter? If yes, how do you work around the biases?
So the question of bias is really interesting. The challenging thing around creating the profiles is that meaning making is such a complex and deeply human thing that it has to be done by humans. So inevitably, it's tricky for one human to reliably make sense of the meaning making structures that another human being may or may not be using. It's quite a tricky process. So it always slightly amazes me that it can be done at all, because in effect, we're building a meaning making technology that assesses meaning making that's being made by somebody else and that we have to make sense of. It's a sort of a third or fourth person hermeneutic cycle that we're in there. It's a very complicated business. So there is inevitably bias. there is inevitably a challenge of how is it that you do that without getting caught out by, for example, you know, if you read a form and you find that you like the person you're reading the form from, you like what they're saying, you have an affinity with the way they see the world, yeah, there could be a tendency to give them a little bit more credit for the meaning that they're making and see a bit more complexity in the meaning that they're making. The reason that we have a moderation process whereby many of the forms are seen by two separate raters is to get around that issue. And we do use interpreters, but what we do is if someone is filling in the form in a different language, the person who commissions the profile organizes the interpretation. So the responsibility lies on the coach to make sure that the translation is good. And I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking, but in terms of having to interpret the form, if it's written in another language, we expect the coach to organize all of that. When it comes to rating, the process of rating a form is essentially by giving each individual sentence a label according to its meaning-making structures, and then there's a calculation done that's both statistical and qualitative based on the combination of those ratings that we've given to each sentence. So that's basically how it works. Go into a lot more detail about all of this in the training. So I hope that answers your question.
I'm just gonna unmute Alex. He's put his hand up. Alex, I'm unmuting you now.
Thank you. My question is about using AI in this support process, and if you've considered doing that.
Yeah. Yes, we certainly considered it. I have a friend who, funnily enough, in a previous role, worked on the European supercomputer, who had a good look at some of our data. And what we found is that there are two challenges. One is that obviously the whole process of analyzing meaning-making structures is extremely nuanced, and any kind of AI process struggles with that. You need to train it. And so what we've found is that one of the limitations on the process is being able to train the AI machine, because we don't have sufficiently high quality or enough data to feed into the machine in the first place to train it. There is obviously new AI now that sort of self-trains and finds its own, literally finds its own data, but there are various procedural complexities with using that. So we're actively looking at it, and I sort of have a slightly schizophrenic relationship to it. On the one hand, I think it's really fascinating, and on the other hand, I have enormous doubts as to whether AI can really do this yet. I'm sure it's coming, but at the moment, I have my doubts about whether it's feasible. But the answer is yes, we're looking at it, and it's an interesting area.
Thank you.
Okay, so there's a couple of other questions which we just skipped from Gregor. The proportions in the 7 transformations article, how much has that changed? And also the ethical considerations question.
Yeah.
By the way, everyone, we're 3 minutes to the hour. Philip, I think you've got could go over a few minutes. Everyone else, don't feel that you need to hang on, but if you are available, please do, and you're interested, please do. Yeah, go ahead, Philip.
So the sample numbers in the HBR article have changed, not dramatically, but they have changed. The thing about the numbers that we have in the Harthill database is that they're not representative samples of the human population or even the leadership population. They're entirely self-selected. So those people who either come forward or are sent forward by their company to be profiled, we have data for. So we sometimes get questions, for example, around, what's the difference between the action logic range of females and males, for instance. And we can look at that in our database, but it doesn't actually mean anything because we don't know anything about how representative the data is that we have. And incidentally, we see no difference between males and females. So the challenging thing for making anything out of those percentages is that we don't really know whether those percentages are reflective of the general leadership population. We can guess that they give us a general indication, but not a very precise one. So for instance, we could certainly guess that in the leadership populations, late stage meaning making, which is individualist and strategist and onwards, is much rarer, around 5 to 8% of the populations that we've come across. And achiever is, an individualist is generally much more prevalent, with around 50 to 60% of the population. But we've found that some companies, for instance, some tech companies that we've been involved with, as many as 80% of the people who come through the programs that they do and are profiled are in some way in the sort of expert to achiever range, which is much, much higher than our usual data would suggest. So it just very much depends on the sample that you're using. So although there's some change in the data from the HBR article, I wouldn't read too much into it. And I think there's one more that I've not quite seen here. Yes, do you find that the profiles are quite concentrated into a few categories rather than spread across the whole spectrum? That's a really interesting phenomenon. When you have a conversation with someone whose profile is very spread across many different action logics, the conversation feels very different than when you're talking to someone and the action logics are relatively compacted into maybe one or two, well, never one, usually it's two or three action logics. And what you tend to find, and I didn't really say much about this earlier, your profile doesn't tell you who you are. It's not a diagnostic like a personality assessment is. It gives you an indication of what's currently active. And there can be all sorts of reasons for that. It's what's currently drawing your attention, in effect, to it. So when somebody has a profile where you've got two action logics that are very dominant, I call it being a bit like a two-horse race. You effectively have two different meaning-making tendencies that are usually in tension with one another. And in that tension, there is often a lot of development and learning that can happen, because until they've been profiled, people can't normally tell that. They can't normally see that that's what's going on. But in their experience, they might constantly find that they're going backwards and forwards between different ways of looking at the same problem and not knowing where, how to do it right. Or the classic example is when someone is spanning both achiever and individualist meaning making. And on the one hand, they're trying to resolve very complex problems using a sort of achiever-like problem solving mindset. Or on the other hand, they're trying to deal with something that just needs to get the job done in a highly complex and overcomplicated way. And until you can tease out these different meaning-making structures that are active, it's very hard to be strategic about how you approach different kinds of tasks and different kinds of situation. So yes, the different spread of action logics that you see in profile graphs is a really useful conversation starter and a really useful exploration for people, I find. Ethical consideration.
Yeah.
So yes, the ethical considerations are real. I think they are in any approach. Anyone who adopts a specific approach and sort of lays it on the client, whether they like it or not, that's tricky. I personally, obviously being a clinical psychologist, we're working with a lot more complicated ethical issues than whether someone's up for development or not. We're working with very, very different sorts of power dynamics and issues of consent and so on. So I've tended not to find this approach very ethically problematic, but obviously there are huge ethical implications to how you hold the relationship with the client and how you use your influence. So one example of that would be if you are trying to broach the issue of development with someone and they're just not interested and just not open to it, then I think it's important to drop it and stay close to the client's frame of reference. I have had clients, very few, but I have had clients where they just don't want to go there for whatever reason. They're much more focused on the specific issue that they're dealing with. And the best thing to do is to stay close to their frame of reference and work with what it is that's important to them. And you know, if you've planted a seed, perhaps later they might be more open to it when the circumstances are right.
Great. So look, I think we're kind of there or thereabouts. I'm not seeing any other new questions, but of course, if somebody has got a question we haven't covered, just raise your hand now. We've got 2 people that said they were interested in the suggestion you made, Jane and Michelle. So if anybody else would like to take Philip up on his offer, to put it in the chat or just put a question.
Can you send me an email? That'd be great.
Yeah. All right. And do you want to put that last slide on so you can see the email?
Sure.
Oh, Gregor, you sent an email. Great. Okay. Thanks, Gregor. Just saw that. Also, Michelle Grillo as well. Cool. Have you? Yeah. I'll take your name down to Michelle. Super. Okay. All right, everyone. Well, unless there's anything else, thank you from me. Philip, thank you from you. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Said thank you too. Great. Thanks, Gregor. Very nice of you. Very, very sweet. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Okay. All right. Bye.